of all, if you don't know me, my name is Anna. I'm the outreach coordinator with the Kentucky Master Naturalist. And I'll just kind of be on here in the background, hoping to make sure everything goes smoothly. But of course, the real speaker that we have with us today, and I'm so excited for this one. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about our speaker, but I don't want to, completely steal her thunder because she's got some really interesting things to share with us today. But just a little bit about our botanist and lichenologist of the day. Kendall grew up in Owen County, and she's always been interested in art and nature. And she's carried that with her into her education and her career. And she got her bachelor's in biology at Morehead State University. And she has started at the Office of Kentucky State Nature Preserves as a botanist and lichenologist. So she's been there for a while, and then for the last 5 years, she's been an active member of a society that many of you I know will know about or possibly be members of, the Kentucky Native Plant Society. And she's actually the current vice president, I believe, for 2024 through 2026 term for that. So lots going on with Kendall, lots of things to learn about. But of course, what we're learning about today is lichens. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I will let Kendall bring up her slides. And while you are doing that, Kendall, I'll just let folks know a few quick little orientation things. We're in a webinar Zoom, if you haven't noticed, so you don't have the option to like turn on your screen or unmute or anything like that. But you do have the option to hop into the chat. And you also have the option, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can press the Q&A button and you can ask questions there. So we're going to be covering a ton of material today, lots and lots to learn. This is a subject that I know I myself am not familiar with, and I know that there's lots of room for learning for many of us. So if you've got those questions, drop them either in the chat or in the Q&A box. And whenever we pause for questions, I will, make sure to bring those to Kendall's attention. We'll get those answered for you. And then afterwards, Kendall will be sharing some notes and PDF material that you'll get via email. So don't stress out if you're a note taker. You are going to get this material in your email after the presentation. So having said all that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our guest speaker.
All right, thank you, Anna. Can I get a thumbs up that you can hear me and see my presentation? Yes, awesome. All right, hi, hello, everyone. As she said, my name is Kendall McDonald, and I am a botanist at the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, and also the state's lichenologist there. Today we're going to talk about lichens, do a little bit of Lichen 101, and some of you have seen a version of this presentation before in 2021, but I have added some updates and some new educational fun topics for us to go over, so everybody should be able to get something new out of this today. Ooh, come on now, there we go. All right, a couple of housekeeping things that I just have to do for my agency. We're the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. We have a lot of different statutes. We are the State Nature Preserves program. We are the clearinghouse for all information on the environment, plants, and animals. We are the Wild River System and the Kentucky Heritage Land Conservation Fund and the Rare Plant Program for the state. We can serve a lot of different kinds of lands through all of these programs. I believe over 150,000 acres, or maybe just over 100,000 acres right now, somewhere in between there. All across the state, we help conserve, we either own ourselves or we own with partners to make sure our most high quality lands in Kentucky are protected. We have the Natural Heritage Database with over 20,000 high-quality source feature records, and we are also the facilitators of the Kentucky Biological Assessment Tool, or the KY-BAT, which is an online self-service tool. So if you have a project, you can put the boundaries of that project in to this online tool, and it will spit out a report for you within minutes about any rare communities, animals, or plants that your project might impact. We have a natural areas conservation and management branch, a biological assessment branch, and we also do environmental education and recreation. But enough about those things. I know we're here to talk about lichens today. So we're going to start at the ground floor at the very beginning with what are lichens. So I'm going to give you guys a little story. So gather around the campfire. I did not write this story, but it helps a lot of people understand what lichens are. Lichens, a love story. Lichens start with the story of Alice Algae and Freddie Fungus. Freddie Fungus was an excellent carpenter, but he wasn't a good cook. In fact, he couldn't even make his own food. Just like all fungi, he had to search for dead plants or animals to eat, and sometimes he went hungry. One day, while Freddie Fungus was looking for food, he followed a tempting aroma to a rundown house. Inside was the cook responsible for the delicious smell, Alice Algae. Seeking an opportunity to trade his skills for food, Freddie Fungus offered to fix up her house, and Alice Algae agreed. After spending a lot of time together, Freddie Fungus and Alice Algae inevitably took a liking to each other. And from then on, Freddie Fungus would build the house, and Alice Algae would make the food. And they lived happily ever after. Now, Alice and Freddie may have been in love, but the scientific word for this relationship is symbiotic. In this, the algae provides the food for the organism via photosynthesis, and the fungus provides the structure. Now, this isn't just some you put some algae and fungi into a jar and shake it up and you get a lichen. This is something that is very, very structured. And we have a cross-section of a lichen on the right here. If you don't know what a cross-section is, that's okay. I'm sure you're familiar with a loaf of bread cut into slices. And a cross-section of an organism is basically like a slice of bread from that loaf, where you can kind of see the inside of the loaf of bread and also the crust on the outside. So we took a slice of our lichen loaf here and put it underneath a microscope, super, super tiny, you can see. And you can see we have some layers, kind of like a cake. We have an upper and lower cortex, and all that means is it's a fungal layer, and those fungal hyphae are really tightly packed together, so much that they're creating this hard protective shell and creating the structure of what that lichen looks like. Right beneath that upper cortex, we have our algal layer, which has our algae or blue-green algae bacteria, excuse me, that you will do our photosynthesis and create food for our lichen specimen. And underneath that, we have this fungal layer of more loose fungal hyphae that isn't really hard, isn't really providing protection, but just kind of giving form and more of a 3D structure to our lichen. So all of that was correct until 2016, when we had the great yeast discovery. I think this guy is pronounced Spreelbill. I'm not really sure on the name pronunciation there, but in 2016, they discovered that yeast is actually one of our components of a lichen. So what does the yeast do? Where is it hanging out? How did we not know it was here? Well, these yeast are microorganisms, super, super tiny, and it takes a very complicated and delicate testing process to even be able to detect the presence of the yeast in a lichen. So no wonder it didn't go detected for like 140 years or something, since lichens were first described. In 2016, that was 8 years ago, but that is relatively new in terms of the scientific timeline. So people are still kind of proposing ideas as to what the yeast could be doing. And one of the proposals is that yeast is kind of the trigger that determines, when we get an algae species and a fungal species together, that's the yeast interacts with both of them and apparently might be the trigger that determines what lichen species is created when all of that comes together. And some people are arguing against that and things like that. It's still being investigated, but very, very exciting to have this discovery and understand lichens more. And so now we get a new definition of what a lichen is. It's no longer just a symbiotic relationship between algae and fungi. It is, buckle up for this definition, a lichen is a self-sustaining ecosystem formed by the interaction of an exhabitant fungus and an extracellular arrangement of one or more photosynthetic partners and an indeterminate number of microscopic organisms. So that is a mouthful. So I made a little table at the bottom here to kind of break it down. So the photosynthetic partner is the algae. So we have 1 to 2, possibly 3, but very rarely 3 species of algae within the lichen. We have 1 species of fungi, and then yeast and other microorganisms. We have at least 1, possibly several. And we don't really know how many there is yet, what the range is, what the diversity of that is yet. So it's an exciting time in lichenology where we're, really discovering and redefining what a lichen even is. So lichen growth forms and coloration. We kind of go through this because if I was talking about plants, you guys would know the difference between, a tree, a bush, a flower. But for lichens, it's much smaller, the difference in growth forms. And we kind of have to get microscopic to be able to tell them apart. So these are the 4 growth forms I'm going to talk about today. There are many more growth forms. They're kind of sub-growth forms in between these growth forms, hybrids. But these are the main 4 that we are going to talk about. These are the ones you'll see the most. So I've made these little drawings. They're not to scale or anything. They're just to facilitate understanding. And these will be throughout the rest of the presentation. But they'll always be labeled, and our orange will always be that cortex. We're talking about that hard, protective fungal layer. The tan will be that loose fungal layer within the lichen. The green will be the algae layer that does the photosynthesis, and the gray will be the substrate, and that is just meaning the surface that the lichen is growing on. So the first growth form we'll talk about is foliose. Foliose lichens, if you look in the little diagram in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see it has all of our layers. It has an upper and a lower cortex, so it has a distinct, upper surface and lower surface. It has an algal layer and a fungal layer, and it can be easily separated from the substrate that it's growing on. So if you wanted to collect this lichen, you could very easily grab it with your hand or possibly with a knife and just nick it off of whatever it's growing on and collect it. And it'll always have, if you're looking at these photos, it'll have a leafy kind of look to it, and a loby kind of look to it. And so a way to remember that, foliose growth forms look like foliage because they are leaf-like and loby. And that's kind of something that can help you remember what foliose is. So foliose was defined by having all the layers, and this growth form, crustose, is defined by having a layer missing. So we still have our upper layer, our upper cortex, we have our algal layer, but our fungal layer, with that loose fungal hyphae, it actually grows down into the surface of the substrate that it's growing on. So because of that, there is no distinct lower surface on a crustose lichen. And since the lichen is growing within its substrate, it has this painted on appearance. And if you wanted to collect one of these specimens, you would actually have to take a chunk of the substrate with it. So you'd have to take a chunk of that rock or that tree, or a chunk of the soil. And if you didn't, you wouldn't be getting all of the lichen. And then we'll talk about fruticose. So these are the ones people notice the most. These are our largest lichens, our showiest lichens, dare I say, our sexiest lichens. They are erect, pendant, shrubby. They're all over the place, very easy to see, very colorful. But they don't really have a distinct upper and lower surface because they are a tube shape. And so a tube just has one outer surface. And then the algal layer is on the inside of the tube in a layer, and then our fungal layer with the loose hyphae forms kind of a central cord within, or layer within that tube. So we don't have that upper and lower surface. And then squamulose is kind of one of our in-betweens that you'll see more of. It's kind of an intermediate between foliose and crustose. I like to say that this one looks like shingles. If you had a bunch of little lichen lobes and you overlapped them a little bit, like you would shingles on a house, that is what a squamulose lichen is. So it always has a distinct upper surface, but only sometimes does it have a lower surface. And the other half of the time, their fungal layer, those loose fungal hyphae, are growing into the substrate. So, we get some interesting kind of beautiful forms with that. And lichen colors. So this is really interesting. Excuse me. Both of these pictures are the same exact species. This is the lungwort lichen. But we have a photo on the left where it is hydrated and a photo on the right where it is dehydrated. So the color difference, like what in the world is going on? What's going on is the algal layer. In the hydrated version, we have plenty of water. The algal layer is happy. It can do photosynthesis. And this green we're seeing is the chlorophyll in the algae. But when there's no water, when things dry up, there's no rain, lichens don't have roots to gather water from the soil. So they just kind of dry up. And the chlorophyll gets so small and so dried up and so tiny that you can no longer see the color of them. So what you're seeing on the right here, this kind of bone tan gray color, is actually, you're just seeing the fungal layer of that lichen. So this ability, they have to be able to survive these periods of, extreme dryness where they're not doing photosynthesis. So how are lichens surviving this? Well, they have this really cool adaptation called poikilohydry, and that is just a fancy word for saying that they can survive being dried out. And for lack of a better comparison, they basically hibernate until there are favorable conditions again to do photosynthesis. So they just kind of hang out and wait for the rain to come back. And so in 2005, the European Space Agency wanted to test the limitations of this in lichens. So they took lichen specimens up into space and exposed them to the vacuum of space and the temperature fluctuation and the radiation of space for 15 days, and then brought the lichens back to Earth and then gave them water and light to do photosynthesis. And every single lichen specimen showed no change in its ability to photosynthesize after being exposed to space for 15 days, which is just incredible and just an amazing survival tactic for this lichen, for lichens in general. So if they're so tough, why do we talk about lichens being so sensitive and sensitive to air pollution? Well, let's go back to plants for a second. If you're a plant and there is an abundance of water, it's just raining, 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 raining. You have mechanisms within your anatomy that can help you regulate how much water comes in and how much water leaves. You have a waxy cuticle, we have stomata, we have roots. You can do guttation. There's lots of things to deal with the intake and outtake of different substances. Lichens, unfortunately, have nothing like that. They have no waxy cuticle, they have no structures, nothing like that. They are just at the mercy of whatever is in their environment. If you had a lichen and you stuck it in a bowl of motor oil, it would just soak up the motor oil because it has no choice. So when a lichen is growing in an area where air pollution is high or water pollution is high, that pollution gets into the rain, into the fog, into the air, and that lichen, is just victim to that and just has to suck that in, and it'll take in pollutants, it'll take in those pollutants, and it has no way to get it out. So those pollutants are just stuck there. And over time, that happening over and over and over again, we get pollutant accumulation in the lichen, and eventually it just becomes too much and kills the algae within the lichen. And without the algae doing photosynthesis, the lichen dies. So lichens are variably resistant to pollution. Basically, as your surface area increases, as a lichen, you are increasing your exposure to pollutants, and therefore you are more sensitive to pollution. So our fructose lichens that, are growing up in these tubes and these 3D structures that are bushy and larger, they're the most sensitive to pollution because they have the most surface area and are exposed to it the most. And then foliose lichens would be the next sensitive, and because they've got an upper and a lower surface to soak up pollutants and eventually die off. And in highly polluted areas, we often only see crustose lichens because half of their surface area is buried into their substrate and they are not as highly exposed to pollutants. So they are able to be a little more resistant and hang in a little longer than other lichen forms. So I'm going to pause there for a second. If there are any questions in the chat or any questions relevant to what we just went over from the people submitted, Anne or Ellen, is there anything? I can't really see the chat, so someone's going to have to tell me.
Oh, so interesting. One question that I had for you is, do they know what kind of yeasts or these new partners or other microorganisms? I know that, lichens have fungi, and fungi are yeasts or fungi, but are these totally different fungi from the ones that are kind of providing that hard exterior, or are they kind of related to those?
Yeah, they are completely different. So at the bottom right here, I'm gonna attempt to pronounce this. Don't I think it's Basidiomycetes yeasts, and lichens are mostly Ascomycetes fungi. So it is a different kind of fungi that was discovered in just these microscopic amounts within the lichens.
Oh, that's fascinating. Any other questions? All right, it looks like you're good to proceed ahead.
All right, we'll get into some basic lichen anatomy. And I want to go over this because, again, if I was talking about plants, you guys would already be, you'd already know what a leaf, what a flower, what bark is, a stem. But it can be a little alien for lichens, so we'll go over some things. Up here at the top, I have 14 circled and kind of bracket around the entire lichen body. The word for that we use is thallus. That is with a TH, thallus. And that is the entire body of the lichen. If you have multiple lichen, it becomes thalli. And then we also talk a lot about lobes, which is number 13 I have circled with the bracket. And when we talk about a lobe, we're just talking, think of an earlobe or something where, it comes in, it comes out and makes this nice little lobe shape. We talk about thalli and lobes a lot in lichen. So we'll start at the upper surface and we'll go down through the lichen and different anatomy that you can experience as you go through and, look at lichens in nature. So on top of the lichen, sometimes certain species will have what is called pruina, and that's just the name for a powdery covering on the upper surface. And there are some thoughts about why this might happen. The main theory, I believe right now, is that this powder is usually foul tasting and therefore is to prevent herbivory. But the presence, absence, color, location of pruina can be things that can help you ID different lichens. Going down to the upper surface, pseudocyphely, crazy name, just means a break in the upper cortex. So you'll see in the photo in the middle, there are these white dots on the lichen that I have arrows pointing to. And you can see just right down into this white. And if you look in the diagram on the right, you can see that what's actually happening there is there's a break in the upper cortex, and the algal layer is also missing underneath that break because there's nothing to hold it in. And we're seeing straight down into the fungal layer of that lichen through these little breaks in the upper cortex. And so again, size, shape, location, color, abundance of pseudocyphely can be some features that are used to identify certain lichens. Similar to pseudocyphellae, we have maculae, but the difference here is instead of being a break in the upper cortex that you see down to the fungal layer, the upper cortex is still there, but the algae between the upper cortex and the fungal layer is missing. And so what you get are these kind of white lines on the upper surface where you're seeing through that cortex to the fungal layer. And so I've got some arrows pointing to those white lines. It's very hard to take photos of maculae. It's a very microscopic feature, but you can kind of see it the best on the photo on the left, especially toward the bottom ones. You can see those white lines pretty well in the older parts of the lichen. So again, abundance, color, how big they are, if they're there or not, are another thing that can help you ID lichens. The lower surface, cyphellae. So we had the pseudocyphellae before, which are on the upper surface, and the cyphellae, usually in Kentucky specimens, occur on the lower surface. So this is a hole in the lower surface of the lichen, and I've got arrows pointing to this. This is a very interesting lichen picture on the left. This is the moon crater lichen, and the crater is named that because of these holes in the lower surface that somebody thought looked like craters of the moon. But a cyphellae is a break in the lower cortex, and there are specialized cells all the way around that break. Just a very thin microscopic layer. You can't see it with the naked eye, but it's just part of the definition. But you see right through the hole in the lower cortex, you're seeing right to that fungal layer underneath. Well, I guess above would be more precise. And lastly, for lower surface, we're going to talk about rhizines. A lot of people mistake rhizines for lichen roots, and where they might look similar in form, they are not similar in function. Rhizines are just little finger-like extensions of the lower cortex that go down to the substrate and kind of attach. And so it is rooting the lichen there in the sense that it's holding it in place, but it does not have any ability to, soak up nutrients or take anything from the substrate at all. It's just an attachment feature. And they can be widely varied, simple, branching. They can look like little bottle brushes, squaros, rhizines. So the presence, absence, shape, form, coloration, length of rhizines are another feature often used to ID. Pedicia and squamules. This is a combination of features that are unique to those fruticose lichens. So, remember fruticose lichens, those are erect, shrubby, pendant lichens that are much more 3D and bushy. And they kind of have squamules on the bottom. And so remember we talked about squamulous lichens. These have squamules that kind of look like squamulous lichens, but it's part of the fruticose lichen. It's a little confusing there, but it is what it is. So that will be the primary thallus. And then the lichen, when conditions are right, will shoot up this stalk or pedicia and have its sexual structure on top in this kind of globular shape, which is the apothecia. So this combination of features is unique to fruticose lichens, and a lot of our cladonias, our British soldiers, our pixie cups that are very flashy and noticeable, you'll see this kind of anatomy. So I know that was a lot. Are there any questions here or any of the submitted questions that are relevant to that at all?
We do have a question, and it's one that I will also admit that I've kind of struggled to wrap my brain around. Do the algae and fungi remain as individuals, just in a symbiotic relationship, or are they a different organism together? So it's hard to understand, I'm not gonna lie.
Yes.
Definitely.
So it's kind of mind-blowing. It's not something that's natural and normal to think about. It's kind of the only thing in nature that really does this. So a lichen, is composed, like the fungal and algal species that are within one lichen are species that can survive independently on their own. But when they are surviving independently on their own, they take on different forms physically, like morphologically. They take on different forms and interact with their environments in a different way. And when they come together, and then having this, perhaps the yeast as the trigger between the two of them, they create a completely different form and function completely different as a new entity and a new species. So I'm not sure that you could, once they're together, I'm not sure that you can pull them back apart and have them live independently, because the way they grow together in the lichen is so different than their free living versions of themselves. So I don't know if that was helpful or more
Yes.
confusing.
Yes, for sure. It's just such a wild concept that I think it's like, it's hard to wrap your brain around it. But thank you. Yes, very helpful.
Yeah.
And then a follow-up question to that, which I was also wondering as well. So we're kind of on the same wavelength here. So, and maybe this is something you're going to get into, but as far as the reproductive parts, is that something that you're about to dive into?
Yes.
Okay, we'll save that for next round of questions, and see if we've still got questions about that, because I know I do right now. So, and we've got some questions in the chat. So I will turn it back over to you for that.
All right. So next one is lichen reproduction. Yeah, wasn't going to leave this out. This is always something people are curious about. So let's talk about making lichen babies. Like many organisms, they can produce asexually and sexually. So we're going to talk about both. We'll talk about asexual reproduction first. It's a little simpler. So lichens like to make pre-packaged lichen babies. They want to be able to send a propagule out into the world and it be able to start its own lichen, specimen as a clone. So it has two different features that allow it to do that. And the first is Ceridia. So Ceridia, if you look in the diagram on the right, they are algal cells that are wrapped in those loose fungal filaments. And this is so tiny, so microscopic. They are anywhere from a powder-like texture to grains of sand-like texture. And if you look at the photo on the left, you can see like these kind of mounds of like a loose powdery substance on the margins of this lichen, and that is Ceridia. So very lightweight. We've got the algal and the fungal elements of the lichen ready to go, ready to be taken somewhere else. Ceridia are meant to be wind dispersed. So, your lichen, you got your Ceridia up there ready to go, big windstorm comes, carry some of your Ceridia off, and hopefully, lands it onto a suitable new substrate. So it's on this new substrate. It's like, what's up? I've got everything I need. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to grow. So over time, as long as it remains undisturbed and has good conditions, eventually a new lichen will begin to grow that is a clone of the one that it came from. The lichens do not just rely on the wind. That would not be the greatest strategy to only put all your eggs in one basket. So they also have another form. This is called Isidia. So Isidia are really similar to Ceridia in that they are, a prepackaged lichen baby ready to go. The main difference is that Isidia have a cortex covering that kind of protects the loose ball of fungi and algae within. And so I've got a couple of arrows pointing to Isidia on this lichen on the left. And you could see they look just so brittle, like little finger-like projections out of the lichen. And they are meant to be brittle and they are meant to be broken because lichens are often eaten by insects and invertebrates. And so I'm going to use this beautiful little blue snail because it is convenient and beautiful. But let's say the snail is hungry, it's dinner time, it's going around having the lichen buffet, and it's just going all around this lichen, eating it. As it goes around, the snail, compared to the lichen, is quite heavy, quite big, and it's breaking off these Isidia, just breaking them like crazy. And the snail, being a snail, has slime, that makes it sticky. So as these acidia break off, they're sticking to the snail's slime. And when, the snail is like, all right, dinner's over. I'm going to take my after dinner walk, burn these calories. It's going to go up or down the tree or wherever it goes. And as it goes, eventually those little acidia will fall off of the snail and be stuck to hopefully a new suitable substrate. And then again, over time, as long as, conditions are good and it's not disturbed, that little lichen baby will form into a clone of its original lichen. So then we get to sexual reproduction, which gets a little more complicated. So we got to introduce a new structure here. This is called an apothecia. All these little disc-shaped structures here you see on these various lichens. I like to say they kind of look like a fruit tart, with the margin of the lichen being like the crust and the hymenium being like the fruit part of a fruit tart. But yeah, they always have this margin, and they always have this different colored hymenium in the middle, giving it this appearance. But how in the world does this do reproduction? Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. There's also another variety of an apothecia, and we go back to that fruticose lichen type that we were talking about before that has, this primary and secondary thallus. On top of that, we have the apothecia, and when it's on top like that, it takes more of this globular form instead of like a disc shape. So how does an apothecia do sexual reproduction? Well, first off, the fungal part of the lichen is the only part of the lichen that is doing sexual reproduction. The algal part is not involved in this at all. It's just, doing photosynthesis to fuel this process and the creation of spores. So, we have our little lichen cross-section diagram on the left, and we have our apothecia on the top. And then in the center here, I have a little bit more zoomed in, and you can see these kind of they're pink on my diagram, these flask-shaped structures within the apothecia kind of below the surface. And then zoom in again on to the very right, we can see the fungal spores within that ascospore within the lichen. And so it's very, very small. We've just got it's like a Russian doll. You've got like this inside of this, inside of this, and it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So this is what this looks like in real life. This is a cross-section of an apothecia where I have circled an ascospore with spores in it on the left here. And so I believe this is at like 1,000 magnification. So this is just tiny, tiny, tiny. But this is what holds all of our spores in a lichen. So how do they get the spores out? Well, within that apothecia, it is creating more and more spores as it matures, as it ages, as it has favorable conditions. But there is only so much space within that apothecia. And so pressure begins to build up. More and more pressure, more and more pressure. And then eventually that hymenium we talked about, the little covering that's the fruit part of the fruit tart, it is designed to explode with that pressure. And when it does, it shoots out fungal spores into the environment. And now here's where things get a little more interesting. When these spores go out into the environment, there's kind of two options for them to live out their life as a lichen. They can either land on a suitable free-living algae, and now we know yeast has to be there as well. It can land on that and create a completely new lichen. And so that would not be a clone at all. That is a new individual. Or those fungal spores can decide, well, I guess they don't decide, but they can land on an already established lichen. And if they are strong enough, they can kind of kill the fungus that's already there within that lichen and take it over and begin to take over that algae in that already established lichen and begin to establish a new lichen and kind of kill off that old one. So that is where it gets complicated. Is that a clone? Is it a new individual? Is it a hybrid? How do we define that? And I think that is still kind of debated there. But then over time, again, we get a new lichen, whether it is a new individual or some kind of clone or hybrid. A new lichen will occur over time in suitable conditions without disturbance. So I know that reproduction is a little crazy. So we'll go ahead and have questions here about that.
I do have a question that I'm just now looking and probably would have been a little bit more relevant to our previous little section that we had. So I figured I'd just go ahead and pop in and ask it now and make sure this person gets their question answered. But what determines what type of lichen you get? Is it a different type of algae and fungus that's involved in each one? Or what kind of determines what species of lichen results from that symbiotic relationship?
So we're thinking the yeast. So you have all these combinations of suitable algal species and suitable fungal species, and now we have this third element, the yeast. And it's not fully understood yet, but something about the combination and the biochemistry and triggering of having those together and exposed to one another will determine what that lichen species is. I can answer a little more in detail that the fungus species within the lichen does determine like the growth form and shape and generally how the lichen looks. But beyond that, we're doing our best to really figure it out, but we have a lot of questions, especially since 2016. So we are also confused.
Perfect. Good to know. Good to know that lichens are just universally confusing. Even if you're Kendall, there's still mysteries amongst the lichens. We also had a question about the reproductive strategies. Will one type of lichen reproduce both asexually and sexually?
Oh yeah, all the time. They usually, like, it's very common for a lichen to have an asexual and sexual components. And sometimes we'll have multiple asexual components to it too. So yeah, they're reproducing however they can.
Very cool. All right, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you. I think that's what we've got for the reproduction section.
All right, moving on. All right, let's talk about where lichens grow. So lichens grow everywhere. They're actually I think they're on 7% of Earth's surface, and they can grow pretty much on anything and in any environment pretty much. But let's talk about bark. So when I'm talking about bark, I'm talking about bark on a living tree. And not all bark is the same. So if we have a conifer and a deciduous tree, that bark is chemically very different due to the resins and gums that happen in a conifer. So there are lichens that prefer conifers and that chemistry of that bark, and there are lichens that prefer deciduous trees and the chemistry of that bark. And of course, there are generalists, but generally they don't overlap. If something grows on a conifer, it's not likely to grow, on a deciduous tree and vice versa. And also wood. So when I'm talking about wood, I'm talking about dead wood, like a fence, a picnic table, a bench, things like that. Lots of things like to grow on wood, lots of generalists. Things that grow on wood tend to not grow on bark and vice versa. So that's pretty interesting. So we've got, dead or alive lichens will grow on trees and wood. They also grow on moss and dead vegetation and bryophytes, just anything really. It will just take over and grow pretty much on anything, especially if that moss is sickly. It will take over that moss and organic matter to live in. But what's more interesting though is lichens growing on leaves. So this is more common in the tropics where we have these big broad-leafed evergreen kind of species that are all the time there. But in Kentucky, we do have rhododendrons that have broad leaves all year round and, stay for years and years and years. And so on those, you will get lichen growth, especially on older rhododendron bushes. If you look at the leaves, there are lichens and fungi and things growing on those leaves. And just really, really cool to see those kinds of ecosystems on a leaf surface. So rocks and soil, they kind of have some similar properties. So I'm going to talk about them together because soil obviously comes from the bedrock and underneath, and they're very influenced by their geology. So lichens that like a certain kind of rock or soil usually specialize in that. So if there's more of a limestone versus a sandstone kind of soil and geology, for instance, limestone lichens tend to specialize there. Sandstone lichens tend to specialize there. So, you don't really have much of a crossover, and there is definitely some kind of preference in the species for different chemistries in rocks and soil. And finally, lichens continue to grow even on human-made materials and animals. Human-made materials, metal, glass, cloth, plastic, pretty much anything that lichens can get into, they will. The animals are interesting. There are species of aphids and weevils that have lichens growing on their backs. And the lichens will just thrive there and serve the aphid and weevil as camouflage against predators. Lichens grow generally outward in a radial pattern. So when you're looking at a lichen, new growth is generally on the outside, and that's the youngest part of the lichen. And in this picture especially, you can see in the center there, the lichen is dying from the center in its oldest part, but it is, continuing to live as it grows outward. Lichens grow at a very slow rate, but a reliable rate, anywhere from 0.5 millimeter to 500 millimeters a year, just depending on the species. So they can often be indicators. If you measure the size of certain species, they can be indicators to how long that particular site, location, etc., has gone without major disturbance. And when I say disturbance, I mean like physical disturbance to that surface, because physical disturbance to the surface the lichen is growing on will usually kill or remove the lichen. So lifespans of lichens, they are possibly the world's oldest living organism. This species in the photo is the map lichen. We do not have it in Kentucky because it likes granite, and we do not have much exposed granite in Kentucky at all. But this picture is from right over in North Carolina. But not the specimens that grow in North Carolina, but the specimens that grow in the Arctic of the species have been dated, and it is estimated that some of those specimens are more than 8,600 years old. And if that is correct, they are the world's oldest living organism. And so one thing people always ask me is, what are lichens good for? And I love this question because there are so many things that lichens are good for. The first thing is always soil formation. So I want you to think about just exposed bedrock, nothing else, no soil, just a flat expanse of rock. When lichens come to colonize that rock, and they're one of the few organisms that can colonize that rock, they get on the surface and they begin that leaching that I talked about, that pushing of their fungal hyphae down into the rock. And they can go down, I believe, 16 millimeters into the rock. And so, over hundreds, or thousands of maybe even hundreds of thousands of years, you have this chemical leaching happening with the lichens going down into the rock, breaking up the surface. And also you have, the life cycle of lichen death and bringing that organic matter to that system. And eventually over time, those two things create soil. Now, we've always heard, wind, water erosion also creates soil. But when you look, if you had two, just bare rock places, one with lichens and one without, The one with lichens would develop soil 25 to 100 times faster than the bedrock without lichens. So that just shows that lichens are really helping like develop soil and develop habitat for other plants to colonize on that bedrock at a much faster rate than nature, just the elements can do so itself. So that's pretty cool. And they even go a step further in that process. They create the soil. They also stabilize it. So think about that expansive bedrock with this thin little bit of soil. And it's, you know, into July and it hasn't rained in a month and a half and everything's super dry. What in the world is keeping just a gust of wind from, you know, taking that thin layer of soil away? Well, it's the lichens. It's the fungal hyphae I talked about, those like stringy little things that go out from the lichen. They will expand them out and create this mat throughout this thin soil. So if you go to a glade and try to scrape the soil up, it comes up in this mat of soil that's kind of stuck together. And what that is the lichen fungal hyphae expanding out and keeping the soil together in there. Something that might be a little more familiar to you guys, if you've been to the Red River Gorge, you know, that place is just completely loved, and a lot of the trails over time have eroded down and have these sides on them. And if you go there, this lichen that is in the center photo here, if you look at those eroded sides, those exposed soils of the trails, you'll notice this kind of gray-blue color in the soil. And we all know sandstones are yellow, orange, red, brown in color. But you see this gray-blue and you're like, what's going on? What you're seeing is this lichen in the center, horrible name, the fairy puke lichen, but does a very, very essential ecological feature for us, is that it is holding together huge chunks of those soils on the side of the trails and actually stabilizing the soil and preventing erosion, and actually doing the entities that manage those trails a favor by keeping erosion from happening. So that's a pretty cool thing. Tree colonization. So this is way more relevant in tropical areas where the maintenance of humidity is really important to those ecosystems and the organisms that live there. So imagine you're in a rainforest and we get a rain, the rain stops, and then we get a really hot, sunny day. Well, all of the water that's on the surface of the plants, on the surface of the ground, will dry up first. But all of these lichens, this huge biomass of lichens on the trees and on the rocks, still have water in them and release their water via evaporation way slower than everything around it. So when all the water on the surface is gone and already evaporated, lichens are still releasing water into the atmosphere more slowly, and therefore helping maintain humidity of those ecosystems. Some other good things lichens are good for: their role in the nitrogen cycle. They have an ability to fix nitrogen and either leach it out in a usable form, or they give it back to the system they're growing in as they die and decompose. So, you know, fixing nitrogen is something really, really vital, and not a lot of organisms can do it. So they're really doing a lot of favors for many different ecosystems with the nitrogen cycle. They are food for many animals, most famously caribou or reindeer. It is a huge part of caribou and reindeer diet in the winter. I think that's like 80 to 90% of what they eat. But there are also, I believe, over 24 North American mammals that also really rely on lichens as a part of their diet. Nesting material, I believe 30 or so North American birds have been documented using lichens in their nests. So that is a really interesting. Oh, and also northern flying squirrels also use lichens in their nesting material. So that is really cool and just quite cute to see. And lastly, camouflage. This aphid picture in the middle and this moth picture on the bottom right show different ways that organisms can utilize lichens for camouflage. This aphid in the middle, we actually have a species of this in Kentucky. will use a sticky silk-like thread to attach lichen to its back and kind of use it as camouflage. And in the early spring, you can see them very tiny, you know, just a little bit of lichen just moving up or down the tree. And then you get close to it and it tucks in like, oh no, I'm just a little lichen, don't eat me. And blends in with the lichen on the tree. And then this pepper moth on the bottom right, you know, has basically mimicked the pattern of lichen on the tree to camouflage itself. So the last bit I'll talk about is where we are in Kentucky and how you guys can get involved if you would like. I started here in 2017, and the status of lichens at that point was really, really poor in our state. Across all of time and all of science in Kentucky, we had about 4,000 collections and observations of lichen. 4,000 may sound like a big number, but that is absolutely nothing in terms of biological data across an entire state. And we also had no lichen list. We didn't even know really what occurred in Kentucky, or, you know, what's rare, what's not. And if you look at this map on the right, you can see that all these white counties, we didn't even have any lichen information at all. So we began to fix that. By 2020, this was the statistics I gave the last time I gave this presentation. At that time, we were doing preliminary surveys. We were doing specimen data gathering and beginning to create the lichen list and ranks. At that time, we estimated that we had 618 species in Kentucky, that we'd have 1 globally rare species and 60 state-listed species. And boy, were we wrong. We now in 2024, we have completed all of those surveys. We've created the lichen list. We have ranked all of them. We, I believe, are one of the first states in the U.S. to do that, and our program has become a model for other states to create lichen lists and rank them. Like we've been asked by Washington State and I believe Oregon to help them build their models for lichen programs and lists. So now we know, and this is still growing, it's still changing and will for several years as we gather more data. We have 684 species of lichens in Kentucky. We know that 10 of them are globally rare. 11 of them are potentially globally rare, but needs more data to confirm. And we had 141 state-listed lichens. 46 endangered, 42 threatened, 22 sensitive, and several that we think are in those categories, but we need more data to really know and be for sure. So how could you guys help with that? Well, it's super easy. iNaturalist. This is a great place that I've been curating lichen data for years. If you post any lichen observation within the confines of the state of Kentucky, it will be automatically pulled into this project that I check and use for observations. And, you know, it's really, really easy. It's free. You just get it on your phone or on the computer. And just to give an example of the kinds of major contribution you could make, this on the left here, we have the gold speckle belly lichen. This is an observation that was made back in 2019. And I saw this on iNaturalist and I freaked out, because this species here had not been seen or documented by anyone in the state of Kentucky for, I believe, 50 or 60 years. And we had presumed that it wasn't in the state anymore. And so this random person just taking a hike took a picture of this and posted it and confirmed to us that a lichen we thought was no longer in the state is still there and thriving. And since then, we have done some, looking for this lichen, and we have found several many populations of this, and it is doing just fine in the state. And lastly, if you want to learn more about lichens, here are some resources. I'm going to plug Native Plant Society event, Wildflower Weekend, that happens every April. We always have lichen hikes. You can come and learn from lichen experts there. I do lots of educational webinars and workshops across the state like this that you can catch and be on the lookout for. And then also there are some books, guides, and websites that I include on here that are good if you want to get into things more seriously. But that is all I have. If there are any more questions, you guys go ahead and fire them at me.
Yes, first of all, how awesome, how cool. That was really riveting. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. And we do have some questions, particularly relevant to that last little bit of information you shared. We had a question, where in the state do you think we have the most incomplete lichen inventory or has the greatest potential for study? If you could send all of us iNaturalist users somewhere, where would you send us?
Oh, maybe this will. So, okay. Here on the right here is this map of where the observations have been occurring. So you can see kind of where there is not this dark orange red, that's where our gaps are. And I'd say this is generally, you can see concentrations in national forests, big parks, the mountains, big cities. So it looks like Western Kentucky, parts of Northern Kentucky, things like that would be the best place to send people to go look.
Very cool. Yeah, so for sure, if you're not an iNaturalist user already, another compelling reason to, you could be the reason that Kendall has an amazing day when you upload a lichen that has not been seen for 50 years on iNaturalist. So for sure, don't forget to get involved with that project. Is it true that if you make a lichen observation in Kentucky, is it automatically sorted into that project?
Yes, and
Okay.
unless you have like the highest level of privacy setting on, and most people don't, you have to go in and actually do that. So if you just have a normal account with normal settings, yeah, everything you put in that's a lichen, as long as you label it as a lichen, will be pulled into my project automatically.
Very cool. Yeah, it looks like we've got Lisa in the chat is already mentioning that they are going to go out and start documenting. So that's amazing. This is a really awesome opportunity to make a real difference in science. Like, I can't believe how far you've come, Kendall, with just those numbers. And what is that, 7 years? Just absolutely amazing. So for sure, get out there, help with that project. That's really cool. Very, very cool. And then we had another question that I thought was especially interesting as well. Christy was wondering if lichens are useful in decomposing glass or plastics.
I do not know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Interesting thought, for sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't know
Wow.
the answer. I can try to look that up, but I am not sure.
Interesting. Further research needed. That's why we have the
Yes.
master naturalists. And we were also wondering, where can we find aphids and pepper moths that I'm assuming.
Oh, all over the state. They're very common.
So you just got to be able to see past their camouflage.
Yes, yeah. I saw them at the UK Arboretum this year.
Very cool.
So
you
it's
just
best
have
to
to
look
kind of
for
like,
them in
yeah.
late winter, early spring.
Gotcha. Yeah, how interesting, a symbiotic relationship on top of like that's so many symbiotic relationships. It looks like those are all the questions we have now from our lovely Master Naturalist participants. I do know, everybody, if you have questions after the fact, I'm sure you can send those to myself, you can send them to Ellen or Lori, and we can definitely reach out to Kendall and get those answered for you. Again, highly recommend that you pop onto iNaturalist and check out that project that Kendall has going on. And if you need any help finding that, I'm happy to help out with that as well. And you know, make sure that we can get you oriented on iNaturalist. We've got lots of wonderful folks in the chat already saying that they're going to be getting out there and documenting lichens. So hopefully we'll be adding to your list, Kendall. But I think that's all we have for today. We can go ahead and let you all go. But again, we'll get the PDF to you. We'll get the recording to you, and go forth and document lichens.